So as we sit here in March 2024, we're approaching the 4-year anniversary of a lot of peculiar events from the pandemic. Some of the peculiarities surrounded social media platforms censoring perfectly reasonable points of view, many of which turned out to be true. Then Elon Musk exposed the Twitter files. It turned out that much of this censorship was actually done at the behest, or at least the suggestion of the government. That, of course, raises a number of questions around the First Amendment. Most saliently, at what point does the government's impact on social media content moderation turn these social media platforms into governmental or quasi-governmental actors and thus violate users' First Amendment rights? The case trying to answer that question is Murthy versus Missouri, and it's currently weaving its way through the courts with oral arguments that the Supreme Court recently held. One commentator who has proven insightful on this case is Ben Weingarten, and it is here with me today. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
And so maybe if you give us a little background on Murthy versus Missouri, obviously it has to do with any number of topics that were revealed through the Twitter files as censored or influenced or, depending on the interpretation, coerced by the government. But maybe if you give us a little background on the complaint itself and its history through the courts thus far to where it is at the Supreme Court.
Well, Murthy v. Missouri is arguably one of the most groundbreaking cases to be brought on the First Amendment, certainly in the digital era. It emanates out of Louisiana. District Court in Louisiana is where the case was originally heard. The plaintiffs are the states of Missouri and Louisiana, as well as several prominent doctors, including among them Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kohlendorf, who were sort of prominent dissenters from COVIDian orthodoxy, but with substantial records, the strongest credentials one could imagine, and who were signatories of and leaders in developing the Great Barrington Declaration, which essentially said we need to protect those who are at highest risk with COVID-19 mitigation measures, but the young, healthy, et cetera, ought to be able to pursue their lives not under draconian lockdowns. And they and others, of course, face massive repercussions from dissenting from public health orthodoxy. Beyond them, there's also the Gateway Pundit, a conservative website, as well as a health freedom activist organization. So those were the plaintiffs. And essentially what they alleged is that the government engaged in perhaps the gravest assault, certainly in terms of size, scope, and scale, on our First Amendment in the history of the country, maybe the history of the world, frankly, by coercing, colluding with, and cajoling, including using cutouts, social media platforms to abridge speech. First, when it came to the infamous Hunter Biden laptop story from the New York Post, then on all things related to COVID, from lab leak theory through mitigation measures, vaccine efficacy, and beyond. And actually prior to that, in terms of a whole slew of issues around election integrity and outcomes prior to, during, and then after the 2020 election. And since, they allege these government-directed efforts have expanded to a whole slew of other issues, what I would characterize as wrongthink on those issues, disfavored positions in the view of the government and other government-linked authorities. And the record shows in stunning detail the myriad pressure points that government officials, including in the Biden administration and throughout the administrative state, along with, as I noted, these cutouts, some of them oftentimes government funded or ex-government staffed, and certainly facilitated and put together with the government's instruction, pushed these social media platforms to censor speech. And to get a little more specific on it, one of the key linchpins of this effort was a DHS sub-agency, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which was dubbed the nerve center of these operations from the government. And they worked to develop this quartet of groups on the outside, which included the Stanford Internet Observatory and 3 other groups as well, to form this election integrity partnership. And what that partnership in effect did was the government outsourced mass surveillance and then flagging of, for the social media platforms, wrongthink, starting with election integrity and outcome issues, and then EIP itself morphing to the Virality Project, which partnered with the government essentially to quash wrongthink related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's worth noting that the social media companies had pressure from all of these different actors, from the corporate media, from obviously politicians, from the administrative state, and then from these cutouts, which it seems, based upon the record, it was understood were linked to the government. And
When you
those
say
cutouts,
cutouts, so could you specify what you mean by cutouts?
yeah, so by cutouts, it's interesting when you look at the language itself of CISA. CISA coordinated with these outside entities, this quartet that formed the Election Integrity Partnership. It was led by the Stanford Internet Observatory. It also included a University of Washington Center and a couple of other entities as well. All of which, if you look at the personnel who were leading these entities, oftentimes previously had their work had been funded significantly by government, or these were individuals who themselves had worked in government, oftentimes in the intelligence apparatus, the national security apparatus. And essentially, the whole point of setting up what was originally the Election Integrity Partnership, and this is paraphrasing, but in their own words, essentially, was to help government do what it could not do. Basically, CISA knew it ran up against First Amendment issues around mass surveilling speech, identifying offending speech on grounds of purported mis, dis, and malinformation to social media companies, and then begging those social media companies to take it down. So having that understanding that the government could run up against First Amendment issues, and they put in these disclaimers in their emails around these operations, essentially, we're not telling the social media companies to take it down, et cetera. They tried to create something of a Chinese wall, but that was not really there, where these outside entities pushed the very same thing that the government did that the government wanted, executed the work that the government wanted executed. And part of that work, maybe even more significant than mass surveilling 859 million tweets on Twitter during the 2020 campaign for wrongthink and identifying a population of 20 plus million potential offensive tweets or retweeted tweets, was simply this. They worked to get the social media platforms to change their terms of service. And at the same time, they labored to get those social media companies to change their terms of service around quote unquote election delegitimization narratives. At the very same time, you had a whole slew of government agencies repeatedly meeting with the social media platforms, talking to them about their terms of service. Have you considered these deficiencies in your terms of service? Yeah. Have you updated them? Will you please update us on what you've done to your terms of service?
Yeah.
Given these
hint, wink, wink. Yeah,
exactly. And interestingly, to that point, when this actually got into briefs before the Supreme Court, and I can explain how we got there in a second, both sides, both the plaintiffs in the case and the government, used the line, again, paraphrasing here, nice business you've got there, shame if something happened to it. They came at it from different sides, but obviously one of the issues here is when the government comes to you with the awesome powers of Section 230, of antitrust, of the bully pulpit that's going to freak out your shareholders and advertisers, and they come to you and say, you're killing people, as Joe Biden himself said, using the bully pulpit, because you are allowing people to traffic in dangerous mis, dis, and malinformation. That's chilling. And that is obviously going to cause you to react differently than if John Doe off the street flags some random tweet from an account with an egg on it and says, this is a problem. Yeah. So with that background, essentially what the plaintiff said is, and there's obviously precedent here, including before the Supreme Court, the Norwood case, the government can't make private entities do what the government wouldn't lawfully be allowed to do itself. So by pushing and prodding and pressuring the social media companies to take down protected, oftentimes clearly core political speech, at the end of the day, they converted the social media companies into state speech police. That's what the plaintiffs argued. The government fought this, but they lost originally, at least on a preliminary basis, in the district court in Louisiana, where The judge issued a stirring and stunning order on July 4th of last year, saying that it did appear that this was maybe the most massive First Amendment violation in the history of the country, executed by the Biden White House, the CDC, FBI, CISA, and the Surgeon General's office. And as a consequence, the government needs to cease these activities, and laid out a really detailed and large injunction prohibiting the government from continuing its speech policing by proxy during the pendency of the case. And obviously what the judge was saying in that order was the plaintiffs are likely to prevail. That's why you need to freeze this activity pronto. The government appealed. They appealed to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And there, the Fifth Circuit essentially agreed with the logic of the lower court, but they significantly narrowed the preliminary injunction and they modified the preliminary injunction. They took out some of the players that the plaintiffs had identified as First Amendment violators, but the core argument remained. The government converted the social media platforms into state speech police.
Mm-hmm.
The government fought, of course, and went to take the case to the Supreme Court. And essentially, the government's argument the whole time has been, it's not our First Amendment right that's been violated by the government. Actually, we're violating the government's free speech rights by preventing them from hectoring the social media companies to censor us on all manner of wrongthink. That we're doing irreparable harm to the government if these agencies can't go to social media platforms and say, please take down this wrongthink, or why the F haven't you taken down this wrongthink? And that's the kind of colorful language that you see in some of the discovery in the case. So this case landed before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is to answer a few questions. One of them is the issue of standing in the case, always an important technical question here, obviously. The second is whether First Amendment violations occurred here. And the third is, was the preliminary injunction, were the terms and breadth of the preliminary injunction lawful and appropriate? And so I had the opportunity, I was privileged with the opportunity to have a front row seat at oral arguments, which occurred a week before we're recording this podcast. And I put out there sort of my black pill take on it, and I'm happy to discuss that take.
Mm-hmm. We'll get into the black pill take, because I could see where that could be what you gather from the various oral arguments, although I'm not entirely sure that it's the accurate one, because it would seem that the some of the Supremes did seem to take at least take a marker or take a point from the district court judges and the district court judge originally, and then the Fifth Circuit. However, just to give some people a little more framing and understanding of what the issues are here, and you described it very comprehensively, but essentially, if the government there's got to be a line, because the government, one of the arguments they make is well, if this injunction, if any ruling here is too overbroad, it essentially would capture and prevent the government from any sort of administrative function. That, for instance, the CDC couldn't even issue guidance as to what the CDC thought was the right public health approach, because that would be considered coercion, because the social media platforms then might take that as an insinuation that they have to follow and censor any point of view that runs contrary to the CDC. That's obviously a little bit absurd and taking it way too far, but that's how the government's going to try to paint it. So you're trying to draw that line between persuasion and coercion. The government's going to argue that it's so difficult to draw that line that you can't draw it, period. You need to let us do what we need to do. And the citizenry and the counterparty there is going to argue that you definitely can draw it, that you can clearly see when it's more than a suggestion being made, when there is some sort of explicit or implicit threat of consequence, of punishment, or, as we say, like, hey, nice little business you've got there, would be a shame if you lost it, or if your shareholders realized that the government frowned upon it and all of a sudden it tanked 5% in value, which could be billions of dollars, right? So that seems to be the line that we're trying to draw. And you make an interesting point, because the stuff around the pandemic is a little one of one. right? Because we haven't had a pandemic before the 2020 pandemic in about 85 years, and there was no internet, nor these types of concerns were not really palpable at the time. However, election interference, that's something that really was manipulated and really did seem to be changed in real time, because we've had elections for quite some time now, and we've had people who've denied the results of those elections, particularly a lot of people during the first 15, 12 years of Twitter. You could certainly go search and find people on that platform that believed that George W. Bush's victory in 2000 was the result of some nefarious, illegitimate activity, right? In 2017, if you expressed that view very aggressively, even on social media, on Twitter, nobody made a peep. Everyone considered, a couple people might have thought that you had a point. A couple people might have thought that you are some blathering idiot and howling at the moon. But either way, you weren't going to get censored. All of a sudden, the rules need to be modified, need to be changed, need to be reconstructed to capture what otherwise would be that behavior, but specifically to negate or punish or prohibit any insinuation or any claim that Donald Trump was the legitimate winner of the 2020 election. And various people are going to have various opinions on the substance of that argument, but nevertheless, it was a topic. It was an issue that was active in the speech ecosystem for quite some time, and all of a sudden, because of these specific circumstances around the 2020 election, all of a sudden the social media companies completely revised their perspective and their rules around it. And I think that seems to be something that is hard to ignore. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot to unpack there. One thing to your original point is, and a standard, and I wish that the plaintiffs had made this argument, is one way to look at the issue is, would this content have been set aside for a moment, the merits of the content? Would this content have been taken down had the government not done what it did?
Just a real quick give everyone from the legal world, it's called but-for causation, that in trying to determine culpability, liability, or a prong in a cause of action legally, that you're asking, would this results have occurred but for this other factor being present or occurring? And whether that is an answer yes or no will in many cases yield the conclusion or the liability.
Right. And the government standard is sort of, using, would a person independently have done this, and would it have been reasonable to assume that the social media platforms would have acted the way they did anyway? And the government argues, well, because there are these emails and there's plenty of communications around government partnering. And that, I think, is a chilling and disturbing thing to begin with, but set that aside. Government partnering, and the government says it was essentially a two-way street. The tech platforms really wanted to partner with the government to know what to take down. And also, to your point about the notion of, well, this is going to chill the government speech. And Justice Thomas himself sort of asked, what's the constitutional basis for government having speech? And the government itself said, well, this is just part of our constitutional structure. This is sort of how the thing is unfolded in practice. But the issue is not taking away the government's right to speak on issues. It's the government taking away our right to speak on issues. And I wish that also had been something that the plaintiffs might have hammered home. But yeah, to your point on election interference and election speech, I mean, Stacey Abrams and all of Stacey Abrams' followers, there was never a peep about using government authorities to shut them up about what happened in Georgia. If the Trump administration had come in and said, anyone who says that Russia stole the election for me needs to be censored because it's poisoning our democracy and it's leading to people to be hysterical and corroding our discourse. And anyone who ever espoused the Russian collusion theory was sowing discord within our democracy and undermining our system. And because they're threatening democracy as a matter of national security and to defend our institutions, they ought to be blackballed from every single platform. You can imagine that would be laughed out of the room and it would be killed in court. So, there's an issue of if the shoe were on the other foot here. And I think in part, those who are on the other side of this issue, which is largely, but not entirely, the left, or what is defined as the left today, I don't think they could imagine a scenario where conservatives would do the same. I mean, they might say it. They talk about, ironically, book banning in the way of, a school in a certain district says we should or should not have these books for children in a library that we pay for as taxpayers, and having some discretion over a finite number of books and what the substance is constitutes book banning. But here you have essentially people en masse, entire narratives, whole stories get taken down, which, and by the way, of course, we can make an argument on principle that even if people are entirely wrong and deluded, they should still be allowed to put forth their arguments. But obviously, there was plenty of truth that went out there that people had no way of knowing about, hearing about. And one thing that came up in the pendency or during the case is, there's a right to speak and there's also a right to consume certain information. During a pandemic, during a crisis, the government would say, we need to have total control over our narrative. At least that's how they operated. I think the proper response in a crisis like a pandemic is you need to have robust debate, because you're talking about matters that are going to have hugely consequential impact. If there's only one narrative and it's the state narrative, even if the state ends up right, it could still lead you into a place that's not a comfortable place when you're talking about a republic. When we come to the Hunter Biden laptop story, for example, the amazing thing about that example is you had government agencies meeting with the platforms and news entities in advance of that story coming, essentially pre-bunking it. They were saying there's going to be a hack and leak, some kind of dump, potentially from a foreign adversary. You need to be on the lookout for this. What happened? The platforms, of course, changed their terms of service. And then under that changed terms of service, they nuked a story that would have been permitted prior to the run-up to the 2020 election. Obviously, we can debate the merits of did more people end up hearing about the story because it got censored or not? But that should have never happened in the first place.
Sure. What we can't debate the merits of is whether or not it was true or not. It was a true story, and the governmental actors that went and supposedly so-called pre-bunked this story were completely lying. Completely lying. There's other topics here, right? We've yet to reach a consensus. The jury is still out, but once again, we don't know. There are different people who have different perspectives on 2020 election, efficacy of masks, whether or not lockdowns were worth the harm that they caused, things of that nature, whether or not the origination of COVID was a lab leak. What has been proven with incontrovertibly, without a doubt, is that the Hunter Biden laptop materials were valid, and that the people that were claiming that they were a misinformation operation or the result of misinformation were doing so based on nothing, on pure speculation, not a single fact at all. And that's the most egregious one. And I think you might find it interesting, because I got tangibly involved in this because my account, my Instagram account, was taken down 7 days before the 2020 election because I posted a cropped photo of Hunter Biden's torso. Okay. It wasn't even, there was no commentary. It was nothing about the story. It was literally one of the form. So then an individual, I went to Twitter. At that point, I didn't really know anyone who worked at Instagram. Now I know some people who work there. I've got people that I can call if I get censored or disabled. At that point, I went to Twitter because I didn't get my Twitter account disabled. And I tweeted out, man, I got my Instagram account disabled. Facebook employee at the time, who happened to be a fan of mine and followed me, said, hey, I could probably get your account back. Tell me. And he got my account back. He was in Austin. I happened to be traveling to Austin for the election. I go meet him in Austin, and he gives me a little insight into what's going on at IG and Meta. And he's like, yeah, they cranked the algorithm, the censorship algorithms up exponentially, and they were nuking so many accounts that employees at the company, the big issue, or there was chaos internally on the internal Slack channels, because so many Meta, Facebook at the time, employees were getting so many incomings about people that they knew or people that were friends with people that they knew getting their accounts taken back for mentioning anything having to do with the Hunter Biden laptop story. Once again, not a matter of opinion, not a matter of interpretation. This was false. Their moderation policies were based on the false premise, and that was given to them by government officials based on nothing, either knowingly false or recklessly false. It just boggles the mind.
And even more perverse, the most perverse cherry on top of it is that the platforms themselves communicated with FBI officials who likely knew of the veracity of the Hunter Biden laptop because they had it for about a year at this point. Yeah. And when the platforms asked them about it, they chose not to respond. That was their narrative. They couldn't confirm or deny that. So they sat on it knowing the truth and nuked that story. And as you noted, also Any number of accounts got dinged as a consequence of it. And this is just one example, obviously, of myriad examples of, well, first of all, here's the broader theory that is sort of behind the nuking of election-related content. And Mike Benz has noted, by the way, that they were nuking wrongthink around the security of mass mail-in balloting while debates were still going on in state legislatures and between the executive branch and legislators about mass mail-in balloting and all the issues around it. So you are interfering literally in the democratic process of debating the merits of changes happening in real time in the run-up to 2020 election. But I think the most important thing to understand is the mindset, the worldview that's behind this, which is, and this really does emanate, I think, largely from CISA, but it pervades a lot of these institutions in government and outside the government. It's bad ideas can lead to real harms in the real world, and consequently, we need to crush those ideas. Ideas that challenge democratic institutions, so-called, pose a threat to democracy. So if you have the wrong ideas about election integrity measures, there's a nexus between that and obviously exploiting an event like January 6th, that creates domestic terrorism. So consequently, because there's a nexus there, you need to suppress that speech to ensure that there isn't a domestic terrorist threat in this country. And at CISA, they have election infrastructure as one of their mandates, one of their charges to protect it. And essentially, they interpreted that mandate, and there was sort of a foreign to domestic switcheroo, as Mike Benz has called it. I've said using the foreign to target the domestic, where they used the notion that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to say, we have a massive problem with social media information operations that are foreign. But ultimately, between 2016 and 2020, they said, well, it doesn't actually matter to whom we attribute the wrongthink. The issue is the wrongthink itself. And essentially, they interpreted tweets or posts on other platforms that did not comport with the established narrative as essentially mini digital terrorist attacks to be neutralized accordingly. And Jen Easterly, the director of CISA, has now infamously, there's a recording of her talking about how the most critical infrastructure is cognitive infrastructure. So in other words, the government has a mandate, a charge to control the American mind. And that is a worldview that I think is pervasive. When you look at the Biden administration's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, it talks about the need to compete in the information space, including partnering with platforms to combat harmful, quote unquote, mis, dis, and malinformation as they define it. And that's all about defending our democratic institutions. And basically, this is a pretext for censoring disfavored narratives on any of myriad issues that the government might say have some nexus to national security or public health or defending our democratic institutions. And as Orwellian as it is, you can see how it's a recipe and a pretext for a mass censorship regime that they've already started to impose over us.
Yeah. That's the interpretation of the First Amendment. Because listen, and when people mention that not all speech is protected, for instance, there's speech in encouraging, inciting, or planning violent activity. That's, of course, it's the space. It's that closing that nexus and establishing that nexus between the speech and the otherwise unlawful activity, right? And this is something that has been painstakingly grinded against the coals in the American court system to determine, okay, what do we consider speech that is close enough to inspiring or inciting or planning some sort of other illegal activity? And that's something that has been chiseled down by the American court system across decades to some sort of reasonable understanding until this all happened, until social media met the Trump era, the Trump administration and tenure, Russiagate, and then the pandemic. And it just scrambled everything in terms of expanding the scope of the nexus or reducing reducing the strength of the nexus between the speech and the activity to where the government can claim that the speech has enough of a nexus to the actual illegal activity and behavior. And that seems to be the crux of the problem here. So before what you saw from the reaction from the Supreme Court justices, maybe you could boil down what the government, we know what our position is, and we know some of what the government's poor, nefarious activity has been. Now, from a constitutional perspective, can you boil down what the government's argument is for why they should be able to do this?
Well, relying on precedent that's not contra Norwood, but it's in the same realm. They try to split hairs between, and it's more than splitting hairs, but they try to distinguish between this standard that courts have applied of the government coercing a third party to do what it can't do versus what the lower courts accepted, which was significant encouragement.
Hmm.
And significant encouragement is a looser standard if you look at how, for example, the Louisiana District Court defined it in terms of promoting or pushing or seeking to induce essentially an action from a third party actor. One argument that the feds make is, well, first of all, they argue they did not act coercively here. And they try to point to all these examples to say, look, the platforms were really interested in doing this themselves. Just because someone uses bad language, well, and this is something that, in my view, too many of the Supreme Court justices, but a government official will pick up the phone and call XYZ reporter at the New York Times and chew them out about a story or try to get them to kill the story. And you don't make that the First Amendment case of the century. Set that aside for a moment. But they try to make it really hard, essentially, to prove there was coercion. Then they argue that, to your point before, you're going to paralyze the government here. Government officials are going to be afraid to use the bully pulpit. Are government officials not allowed to call up a social media company and say, hey, there are someone's been doxxed and there are threats to kill people or otherwise harm them or their families? The government, and I think with the acquiescence of too many of the justices, talked about all manner of examples around terrorist attacks, for example, incorrect national security related information about troop movements, for example, all sorts of examples that are so far beyond the scope of the facts of the case. But
Hmm.
it's because they knew that they were trotting on likely more favorable ground there, because in many instances, it's really irrelevant to the case. The government's trying to make the case, we're trying to defend national security and public health. We don't want to subvert your rights. And we're going to point to examples or talk in generalities that don't really deal with the actual evidence at hand. And this is setting aside the standing technical issue, because I think the merits are more important here. And I suspect the court will probably rule on the merits ultimately. But their position is essentially, you can't hamstring the government. The government has to be able to help the public and drive forward important narratives to keep us safe and healthy. And dialogue with social media companies is a healthy thing in a democracy. And also, one of the points, which I think is actually an overarching and even maybe more important point than just on the First Amendment and the four square corners of this case, is there's a notion of, if you rule in the government's view wrongly on this and say that we essentially engaged in a conspiracy with the social media companies to silence you, this is going to open up the government to a whole slew of lawsuits around almost any action that the government takes
Hmm.
in connection with any sort of private entity leading to some sort of action. This is going to lead to an avalanche of cases. Now, I actually think that's a hugely important point.
Hmm.
If you believe, as I do, that, and the government has embraced what it's called a whole of society model, for example, when it comes to policing mis, dis, and malinformation, even though they won't characterize it as policing, but whole of society, that we're going to coordinate and work with private entities to push our goals. If you wanted to have total power over civil society, you would do it through those conduits. And you would argue that you're allowed to do it because we're just politely asking you. We're just encouraging you, maybe, but we're not coercing you to do something. If you wanted to impose a social credit system with American characteristics, this is precisely the way you would do it. And they would do it in the most lawyerly way so that it was just up to the line, and that they know that they could get in front of a court ultimately, maybe the Supreme Court if need be, that's going to bless and legitimize and rubber stamp those efforts. So that's why, to me, the case even transcends just the First Amendment, the digital public square, free speech in the digital era, to what happens when the government gobbles up or colludes and coordinates with all manner of other entities in our lives. This could be financial institutions debanking people who hold the wrong ideas. This could be with airline companies, you can't allow this person to travel. Those are obviously extreme examples, your credit score, but that is something that you have in communist China. And we're not communist China. However, you can see the makings of such a system when you have essentially assets from the government's perspective in the way of financial services companies or social media platforms who are hoovering up massive amounts of information and allowing those entities to essentially build profiles on all of us. So with the power comes great responsibility, and the fear is that these hugely advantageous and amazing digital vehicles that we've developed can be weaponized by actors who want power. And so that's why at the end of the day, I think this case transcends just the digital public square, and it gets to a broader question of how are we going to ensure that the government doesn't coordinate or collude with a whole slew of private entities to do things to us that it shouldn't do. And interestingly, in oral arguments, the other case that was heard that day was a case that dealt with this very issue as well, NRA v. Vulo.
And before we get into that case, but maybe you tell us you had a pessimistic reaction to what you heard from the Supreme Court justices. People might find that surprising because currently conservative majority going to be a little more receptive to arguments that conservative viewpoints are being punished by the government, but that doesn't seem to be the case, or at least you're skeptical of whether or not that will be the case with the eventual ruling. What did you see?
Well, Supreme Court watchers, seasoned ones, will tell you you can only put so much stock in what you hear at oral arguments. And you may have sympathetic justices on one side who are going to ask questions to see how strong an argument
Yep.
you'll marshal in response to those questions. In this case in particular, we already saw a dissenting opinion when the court took up the case from Justice Alito, and I think it was joined by Justice Thomas as well, and Justice Gorsuch for that matter, where Alito said, essentially, the preliminary injunction ought to persist during the pendency of this case because we're talking about speech potentially being quelled. And he didn't say this explicitly, but implicitly, in the middle of an election cycle where the case might not be disposed of until June or July. So we already kind of had a sense of where they were. And Justice Thomas, in other cases as well, has talked about the notion of maybe social media platforms should be treated as common carriers. And we don't need to go down those rabbit holes. But there were at least 3 judges coming in who we had a pretty good sense likely would be sympathetic. You also had a sense on the other side of the 3 leftmost judges, Justices Jackson, Kagan, and Sotomayor, that they were likely to be hostile and they were likely to side with the government. You could probably look back at how COVID-related cases were dealt with to discern where they were likely going to come out, and that certainly reflected itself in oral arguments. But one of the things for me, and I'd been to oral arguments one time in my life previously, over a decade before, but I didn't have the same impression that I had this time. The impression that I got, and this is, a layman's view of it, is this is a venue that is an away game when you're not the government, when you are a state or whether you're a private entity. It's very hard to go up against the Solicitor General and his army of lawyers who sit behind him and go before a Supreme Court, which is going to show substantial deference generally to federal authorities. Now, maybe this court less so when you look at how they're going to deal with the administrative state ultimately, but which generally by default is going to be favorably disposed, I think, towards federal authorities and the powers that federal authorities have. This is an away game, in my view, for the American people in the ultimate company town. So that is, I think, the paradigm through which is a useful paradigm, I think, through which to view the challenges that you're up against in any case. Then add to that I don't think the plaintiffs necessarily marshaled as strong a case as perhaps they did before the lower courts. And then you get to the substance of the actual questioning. And a big red flag almost instantly was this bevy of hypotheticals that were thrown at the plaintiffs, including from the likes of Justices Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, who I think are the 3 swing justices on this case. They raised all manner of hypotheticals when there's just this massive factual record there. Mm-hmm. And they really, I thought, should have dealt with the cases that were presented, because the cases that were presented were very compelling in the way of, this is core protected political speech. It's being censored at the behest of the government, or that there's a nexus to the government here. So why are you going into these far more extreme examples dealing with threats to life and limb or national security when it's simply not here? There is a line
that would be the implication being that these judges are more concerned about the blast radius of this particular ruling, and that as the government is arguing that restricting the government from certain speech activities here might impact actual national security issues, compromise national security, or have far-reaching consequences than simply punishing some wrongthink about medical issues on social media.
That's right. That's a great explanation. And Justice Kavanaugh, for example, he talked about the notion of, I've jousted with the press before, or had issues with the press before. And he talked about, they raised the issue of, well, why is this different from a government official calling up a journalist and chewing them out? And, we could go through there are myriad differences, that citizens are not necessarily treated with the same deference and the same protection, First Amendment protection, maybe, as journalists. And there's probably case law that we could look to on that. But, one fundamental difference, obviously, is when you're a journalist at an outlet, that is not equivalent, and you're defending yourself, or your outlet is defending you. That's not the same as when you're one of millions of unnamed Twitter users, and the trust and safety folks who hate your guts and want to see you censored are supposed to be the ones defending you. I mean, obviously, they're not necessarily going to defend you. And I'm sure a good lawyer, and you probably could poke a lot of holes in this analogy between a journalist getting a call from a Biden administration official and social media companies getting told, with myriad potential threats and through 11 different channels, you really need to censor entire narratives, and people, unbeknownst to themselves and with no due process, essentially getting censored, deplatformed, flagged, shadow banned, etc., en masse. So, obvious issues that you can point to there. One of the, I thought, really laughable but unsurprising that it would come from this person arguments put forth was, the Chief Justice said, and this is, just particularly unimaginable under this administration, and probably under most every administration, maybe with the exception of the Trump administration, was, he said, well, essentially, government agencies don't speak with one voice. The EPA might say one thing and HHS might say another. So doesn't that show that any concerns of coercion would be diluted, because different agencies might argue different things on a given issue? And, obviously, the agencies should be directed by the commander in chief, and they speak in one voice and they execute his policies.
Yeah.
So the notion that agencies are going to be competing with each other, and that somehow that weakens the demand that you take down content that the government doesn't like, is just utterly asinine. They also didn't go into issues like, for example, malinformation. The censorship regime talks about mis, dis, and malinformation. Well, what is malinformation? The way it's defined, it's true information that promotes a narrative that authorities don't like. So are the justices completely okay with the, and again, I don't even think we need to get to, was it true or false? Is this a legitimate and well-grounded, meritorious opinion? And is this a garbage opinion that's put forth? But they didn't even go down the road of, so you're saying that you're okay with government officials by proxy censoring people who say true things, but which might lead people to think something that authorities don't like. And so it's sort of, Justice Jackson, above all the other justices, she kind of turned the first... Okay, guys, I need you to hop out of my office for a sec. Sorry about that.
Certainly the input we needed.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey there. What's up, buddy? We needed to have one of these moments.
Yeah.
You know,
I never have this on live TV, so this is great.
We're getting a baby.
Okay. That's another topic for another podcast, guys. Okay, can you guys go up to mommy now? I need like 15 more minutes, okay?
The government's not going to be able to shut that guy up. No
Yeah,
chance.
exactly.
Take,
Ethan,
you
can
know.
you head up to mommy? Ethan, I need you to hop out of my office, okay?
God,
I
see,
assume
that's
you can
why
cut this after the fact, right?
I might not. We needed that interjection. No, because we need powerful free speech voices, and I can't think of anyone more powerful than your
And
son. Just
we need comic relief.
I know to
as
spell
well.
a word.
yes, you do.
Yeah, let me spell it. C-A-R-E, care.
Very good, eh?
And I'm 5 1/4. And I'm 3 1/4. And I'm 4.
Yeah, no, we need more powerful communicators like this gentleman. So no, Ethan, keep doing what you're doing, my friend. An exhibition of why we can't have the government impairing our free speech rights, because it's gonna, you need to let your soul shine. And we can't be shutting that out. Reason for concern, but also a little speculative, because as you mentioned, sometimes the posture taken by the Supreme Court justices in the oral arguments, it's not necessarily reflective of what their views are. It might be them trying to ask questions that will lead them to construct and even, to address counterexamples that they might have in their official rulings or their official opinions. So will be interesting to see when that does come down. Very much related issue that you also put together some interesting thoughts on Twitter, X, what have you, in response to a pretty mind-numbing segment on 60 Minutes this weekend featuring some of the foot soldiers of government censorship, so-called misinformation experts, a new fabricated profession that's really more that it pretends to be kind of neutral arbiters, that professional fact checkers that are trying to do good and keep our information ecosystem and environment clean by exposing exposing bad actors and those who are amplifying incorrect information, but really people who are just looking for what gotchas they can find, what footfalls they can find from one side of the aisle, and whatever information might be inaccurate or could be framed as inaccurate by those who oppose establishment narratives. It was strange to see. Well, I don't expect much out of 60 Minutes these days, but it was still a little shocking to see how much they're willing to take the side of the censors, being that for so many years, 60 Minutes was a champion of free speech and for the notion of free speech that sometimes you might get it wrong, but we need to protect those who might get it wrong, even in the face of inaccuracies, as long as they were in good faith. So you had some thoughts there. Would love for you to expand on them.
Well, one thing to level set is it's always ironic when you have the corporate media companies who are talking about the scourge of dis, and malinformation, and on some of the biggest stories with the greatest impact on public sentiment and arguably the trajectory of the country, these are the most prolific and powerful purveyors of dis, and malinformation.
Correct. Yes.
So I always think it's worth stating that up front. To your point, one of the, and this is sort of an analog to the federal government here, the so-called academic researchers, and the one who's featured in the 60 Minute segment is Kate Starbird, who leads this University of Washington outfit that was one of the quad that formed the Election Integrity Partnership. They present themselves as if they are passive observers who are using new technologies to mass surveil the digital public square and then identify how narratives go viral, what goes viral. And, they make it as if they are, again, these passive researchers, rather than that they are operating with an end goal. And the key point to know about the likes of Kate Starbird and the EIP was, again, they were telling platforms you should change your terms of service, modify your terms of service to make them far more liberal, which is to say, to quash far broader ranges of speech. They identified offending content that they felt hit those changed terms of service that they lobbied for, and they flagged them and sent them to the social media companies who knew that there was a nexus between these quote unquote researchers and federal authorities who were asking for the same thing, to take down this content. So they're not passive, they're active. They're making a value judgment in terms of what's dis, and malinformation and what isn't. They're identifying the categories of speech that are to be quashed. So it's not like it's some value neutral exercise in using big data analytics to understand how the digital ecosystem works. No, they're just trying to put a technocratic veneer on censorship and to do censorship at mass scale and using the technology available to them. And that's one of the things that's so galling about the way it's presented as this is all, well, we're just putting forth our recommendations and these are just innocent researchers who aren't trying to get you censored and violate your right to free speech on behalf of federal authorities. And this has been the response repeatedly by the likes of the Washington Post and then the New York Times had their sort of attempted hit speech on those of us countering the censorship industrial complex, and then the 60 Minutes charade that was put forth. All of it is sort of premised on the idea that the authorities are omniscient and omnipotent, and they know all about what is true, what is false, how to separate the wheat from the chaff, even though they get things wrong all the time, even though knowingly they have things wrong, and then still ram narratives down our throat and do all sorts of corrupt things with the powers that they have. But it's taken as a given. The premise is they know what is true. They know who's lying and who isn't lying. And they're going to use that authority to stifle dissenters. And the reality at the end of the day, as I've argued repeatedly, is they want to have a monopoly on narrative, to have a monopoly on power. Having dissenting voices poses a threat to them. That's why you see the censorship regime really arising, as Mike Benz and others, I think, have persuasively argued, post-Brexit and then post-Trump's win. Because, oh my God, the entire kind of globalist project is now under threat. There are nationalist populist forces that challenge the gravy train, challenge our power, privilege, and prerogatives, and we can't have that. And we have to define those dissenters as actual or would-be domestic terrorists. And this is how you get to, just an anecdote that's worth noting here, what I would argue is a censorship to criminalization pipeline, where you have the case of Douglas Mackey, dating back to 2016, where he puts up a tweet before the election, text your tweet to this number to vote for Hillary Clinton. And it's obviously a satirical tweet. But the DOJ prosecutes him down the road. The Biden DOJ prosecutes him under color of violating people's voting rights by persuading them to vote in a way that you obviously can't vote, and a totally fictitious and joke of an example. And he's been prosecuted and faces serious jail time for it. He's appealing that case, but the chill that it will exist because of that case extends over the entire digital public square. It's if you traffic in ideas the regime doesn't like, they will potentially prosecute you. And it's worth noting that the same law that he was prosecuted under is also being applied to Donald Trump in the January 6th case in D.C.
Yeah, no, the Douglas Mackey case is interesting and concerning. Listen, the counterpoint there is that because he included the number to text your vote, if it had just been the meme without the number, then they wouldn't have had a case, because there were some people who are not particularly bright who will think that their vote had been counted via texting it. And so, I think I don't want to see Douglas go to jail for any meaningful amount of time, and I don't think he will. But a year and what he's had to go through so far is troubling and concerning. But also, I think there's some people that allowed themselves to get made an example of. But if I'm looking at what, in terms of your what you ascribe as causation and a threat to the globalist project, I do think that that's probably the original catalyst. But once the horse is out of the barn, it's going to find some jockeys who just want to ride a horse, right? Like, I don't think Yoel Roth was a core figure of the globalist movement. I think he's just one of any number of useful idiots who finds themselves ideologically offended by certain people and is in a position to punish those people and might try to do so, just like this Kate Starbird person. I think that's probably making up a larger and larger portion of the people who might be the foot soldiers of censorship these days. And also, I think that kind of the energy, some of this was until it experiences friction and opposition, it continues relatively unabated, kind of like you saw with so much of the BLM riots and the violence and supposedly public uprisings around police brutality and police shootings from 2015 to 2021, and that you haven't seen that, and even the couple of the half-assed attempts to foment that of the past 18 months have fallen so flat, is that once something loses steam, it becomes almost impossible to replicate. I don't think the censorship industrial complex will have as much trouble kind of reinstituting itself here, but something as simple, not maybe as simple, but something as unitary as Elon Musk purchasing Twitter and no longer being willing to be a tool of the globalist censorship enterprise, or however you want to describe it, almost that alone, then that empowers a Zuckerberg a little bit more, because it feels a little bit more like Zuckerberg doesn't want to involve himself in censorship, but is willing to bend the knee if he thinks it's going to protect him from the government or help him avoid criticism or protect the stock price. So I think that it's the environment that we encountered 2014, 15 to 2021, 22 was uniquely troubling. And luckily, we've seen some contrary forces recently and a little less appetite to indulge that censorship regime. So I'm hopeful in that regard, but once again, only hopeful to the extent that we remain incredibly vigilant and those forces pushing back in the other direction remain active, right? And continue to apply that contrary pressure. Looking at the Supreme Court case, if you had looking at the district court's ruling, the Fifth Circuit's ruling, and reading the tea leaves on what you've seen so far from the oral arguments, I know you expressed some of your pessimism, but with the caveat, how do you think the court's going to rule?
Well, I guess I generally tend to expect the worst and hope for the best. And I also think it pays to kind of overcorrect, I guess, in the negative direction and then be surprised to the upside,
Fair
just
enough.
as a general principle. That said, I could easily see this being well, first of all, you do have the matter of standing. And on that point, it's worth noting, some of the liberal justices certainly pushed on the standing issue. Even Justice Gorsuch, and I've now seen him do this in a few cases, and if I looked back, maybe this is a big hobby horse of his. And by the way, one that I agree with his skepticism and concern on. He asked the question about, this is another universal injunction. Like, what should we be doing with these universal injunctions? I agree with him. Justice Thomas in the past has also written his opposition, I think, on principle to the idea of universal injunctions, and that there's just a slew of them. He did raise that. I don't know if that's to your point about crafting an opinion, and maybe he'll give a little warning about them to the extent he writes concurrence or dissenting view. But to my mind, I'd be very concerned about Chief Justice Roberts on this, and I'd be very concerned minimally about Justice Kavanaugh on this. So I tend to think that they give wide berth generally to the powerful federal institutions. And so if I'm a betting man, I'm betting this is a 5-4, 6-3 in the wrong direction. And then, we'll have to see ultimately what questions they rule on and how they rule on those questions. I'm curious to see when the ruling comes down, does it go back to the voluminous evidence that exists in this case and not just what we saw in the briefs put before the courts? I hope that they do, because there's just thousands and thousands of pages, so much compelling evidence here about things that are so un-American that it's hard to understand once you know and once you've seen it, how the judges could rule otherwise. But oral arguments certainly had me concerned. So I'm looking at a 5-4 and worse, maybe even a 6-3 decision, in my view, in the wrong way. But we'll have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and an interesting one, and that no matter how the Supreme Court rules and which questions that they rule in finality and which ones they kick back down to the circuit court or to the circuit court, this is something that's going to be ever changing and fluid, because no matter the ruling, let's say they do rule in favor of the plaintiffs and restrictive of government, certain government so-called censorship, influence, coercion, what have you, that is then, that's not the end of the matter. That's not, the government's never going to contact a social media company ever again, or is never going to issue guidance again. It's going to be interesting to see how the government evolves, modifies its position, and tries to communicate and get it and have its voice heard by private companies or companies that control speech in one way, shape, or form, in terms of what it thinks are in the best public interest. And so I think that's going to be fluid, ever changing. Obviously, will depend a little bit on who's in charge and who's running the government and who runs Congress. However, I do think it was super interesting and kind of one of the oddities, but also very revealing about the first Trump administration, that even though some of this occurred while Donald Trump was president, right? Which is the oddity, and that the government, the arms of government, the organs of government, were not working in alignment with the president, and that thing. When we go and write the history of the Trump administration, I think that's going to be very telling there. But that's probably something that we could sit and chop up for another 2.5 hours. So Ben, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us. You've given us incredible insight and context to a absolutely seminal First Amendment case, and one that really that so many issues and so many controversies and hostilities that occurred during the pandemic, or peculiarities that occurred during the pandemic era around speech, around public health, and really divided the country, are now all being kind of co-opted into this one particular case. And that's why it's uniquely interesting. And you've given us a uniquely interesting perspective here. So I wanted to thank you. And please tell everybody where they can find you on the internet, social media, or otherwise.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me. And you can find all my work at weingarten.substack.com. And I'm on Twitter as well, or X, at BHWeingarten.
Once again, thank you so much, everybody. This is The Prevailing Narrative.